Most people trust based on who the other person pretends to be. They read the smile, listen to the rehearsed speech, feel the calculated affection, and call it intuition. They think they are reading another person's soul. They are only reading the mask that the other has chosen for the day. Carl Jung understood something colder. You never see the person. You see the persona they have built to survive the judgment of the world. And while you continue to trust the edited version, there are two psychological signs that escape this control. Two patterns that the conscious mind cannot hide for long. And when you learn to read them, you stop being deceived. Not because you have become suspicious, but because you have stopped being naive. You have been betrayed by people who seemed untouchable, not because they lied well, but because you were looking exactly where they wanted you to look. The persona is not malice. It is protocol. It is the social costume everyone puts on before leaving the house. The face rehearsed for work, for family, for the party, for the first date. You have yours too. That version of you that laughs when you don't find it funny. That says, "I'm fine" when you are falling apart inside. That hugs someone you despise because the situation demands it. The persona is useful. It avoids unnecessary cuts in daily life. But it is also the reason why you have already trusted people who later proved to be exactly the opposite of what they appeared to be. You were not wrong out of stupidity. You were wrong because you were looking at the facade and calling that knowing someone. Jung was surgical in pointing this out. The persona is a contract between the psyche and the world to make coexistence possible. And like every contract, it is made to hide clauses. No one presents the version under construction, the bitter version, the version that does not yet know how to deal with itself. They present the edited, illuminated, palatable version. The problem is that this edited version has an expiration date. It works in controlled environments, in short interactions, in superficial conversations. But there are two moments when the mask cracks, two fissures that the persona cannot cover because they require conscious energy that no one can sustain all the time. And it is exactly these fissures that reveal who is on the other side of the table. The first sign is in the way a person judges. The second, in what happens when their face is threatened. Pay attention to this video until the end, because if you do not learn to recognize these two signs, you will continue to trust the wrong people until the next disappointment seems, once again, like a surprise. It is not. It never was. Observe someone who judges with disproportionate intensity. Not the punctual, mature, argued criticism, the visceral criticism, the one that comes out with anger, with haste, with pleasure, disguised as indignation. Jung would call this projection of the shadow. Translated into less elegant language, the person is attacking in you something they hide from themselves. The shadow is everything the persona cannot admit. It is the swallowed anger, the hidden envy, the denied vanity, the repressed desire, the selfishness disguised as generosity. Everything that was buried so the mask could function is still alive in there, and when it finds a mirror in the world, it attacks. That is why those who talk most about arrogance are usually the most arrogant, disguised as humble. That is why those who judge others' vanity the most are those who look in the mirror most in secret. That is why those who denounce hypocrisy the most are those who practice hypocrisy the most in the name of noble causes. It is not conscious hypocrisy. It is worse, it is weaponized unconsciousness. The person sincerely believes they are on the right side, that they are pointing out a real flaw, that they are making the world better by exposing someone else. But what they are actually doing is expelling outward what they cannot bear to recognize within. Whenever you see someone becoming excessively irritated by a specific trait in another person, perform an inverted reading. That is the characteristic they keep within themselves and have failed to integrate. Intense judgment is a disguised confession. No one hates with such intensity what they do not in some way live within themselves. Hatred for another's ambition is repressed ambition of one's own. Hatred for another's vanity is one's own inhibited vanity. Hatred for another's sexual freedom is one's own confined desire. And when you begin to decode this, every virulent criticism you hear functions as an X-ray of another's shadow. You stop arguing the content of the judgment and start reading what it reveals about the one who judges. And here is the practical warning that most people ignore. Before you trust someone, listen to how they speak about others. Listen to how easily they liquidate the character of third parties. Listen for the subtle pleasure when they recount another's downfall, because the way they treat those who are absent is the way they will treat you as soon as you leave the room. Not because they are evil, because they have not yet looked within. And those who have not looked within project outward all the time without choice. You are watching this video because at some point you felt this on your own skin. You trusted someone who promised loyalty and were later described with the same cruel words that person used to describe others. You were not betrayed. You were predictable to someone who was already showing signs, and you chose not to read them. That is why I prepared the Código do Despertar for you, a 60-day inner map based on the deep psychology of Carl Jung, for you to stop reacting to the world through the eyes of the persona and start reading the signs that have always been before you. Each daily lesson brings a key, a surgical question, and a micro-action to integrate what has been buried, to recognize another's shadow without poisoning yourself with it, and to stop choosing people who will only confirm the same pattern. The guide is in the first pinned comment. If this video touched a crack within you, comment the word desperto, and make this symbolic commitment to the person you are on your way to becoming. The illusion costs more than the truth. It always has. The shadow, contrary to what most imagine, does not hold only the worst. It also holds the forbidden. And forbidden is not always ugly. Often it is luminous. Jung said that there are parts of our soul that were not accepted at home, at school, in religion, or in our first love, and that were therefore pushed into the psychic basement, along with what we usually call defects, a talent that the family ridiculed, an ambition that the environment diminished, a sensitivity that was mocked, a strength that was punished, an intelligence that had to feign mediocrity to fit in. All of this is also shadow, and it also leaks. Only it leaks in a different way, not as hatred, as idealization, as exaggerated admiration, as an inexplicable passion for someone who, apparently, should not have that effect on you. Look closely at whom you idealize. Not the healthy, reasoned admiration that recognizes real merits in a real person. Idealization. That state in which the other person becomes brilliance, becomes a solution, becomes a harbor, becomes an answer. That state in which you feel that this figure possesses something you lack, and for that reason you need to draw near, to serve, to please, to orbit. Jung would say you are projecting. The idealized person carries, in your imagination, a piece of yourself that you never authorized to exist. It is your hidden artist projected onto the artist you follow. It is your repressed leadership projected onto the leader you venerate. It is your stifled freedom projected onto someone who appears free. You are not in love with the person. You are in love with the role they fulfill in your unconscious. And that is why this kind of passion hurts so much when it ends. You do not just lose a person. You lose the mirror where you were finally able to see a side of yourself you did not have the courage to inhabit. The danger here is twofold. First, you give away too much power to someone who is merely playing a role within your mind. Second, you delay the encounter with yourself, because as long as the quality is deposited outside, you do not need to develop it within. It is more comfortable to admire another's courage than to practice your own. It is safer to applaud the freedom of another than to assume your own. It is cheaper to idolize than to integrate. And that is exactly why many relationships collapse when the idealized person reveals themselves to be human. They do not collapse because of disappointment in them. They collapse because you were forced to rediscover within yourself that which you had delegated to them for safekeeping. And no one bears this kind of sudden return well. It is like receiving back a part of your soul that you had already forgotten was yours. The good news is that this return is the beginning of the rescue. The bad news is that most people flee from it and look, the very next day, for someone new to idealize. The cycle begins again. Change the costume, maintain the structure, and grow old under an illusion. The second sign appears when the mask is threatened, and every mask is threatened. It is only a matter of time. All it takes is an exposed error, a well-aimed critique, an uncomfortable situation into which the idealized version of oneself does not fit. It is at that moment that the true personality emerges, not in the speech, not in the intention. in the reaction. Observe someone under real pressure and you will see the core. Because a persona needs time to react. It needs mental space to choose the politically correct response. And when the pressure is sufficient, that space disappears. What remains is who the person is when they do not have time to perform. There are basically three patterns of reaction under pressure. The first is denial. The person denies the facts, distorts the memory of what happened, rewrites the event in real time to preserve their own image. The second is attack. They transform the critique into aggression against the one who criticized, change the subject, attack the moral authority of the interlocutor, shift the responsibility. The third is flight. They disappear, go silent, cut off contact, vanish for days, play the victim, transform their own error into an implicit accusation that others are cruel for pointing it out. None of these three reactions means the person is irredeemable. They all mean, however, that what you see in everyday life is a fragile construction, and that fully trusting a fragile construction is a choice, not an accident. What distinguishes mature people from those who merely seem mature is the fourth reaction, a rare one: to pause, to absorb, to acknowledge. Not to performatively apologize, to acknowledge with the body, with the voice, with a name. To say, "This is mine. I failed here. Thank you for pointing it out." This reaction requires a self that is already partially integrated, someone who does not collapse when they discover an imperfection because they no longer depend on being perfect to feel worthy. This person is rare. When you find them, they deserve the lion's share of your trust. Not because they will never make a mistake, but because when they do err, it will not cost you your sanity to recover from their mistake. And anyone who has lived through the opposite knows that this is the true cost of bad relational choices. It is not the raw damage the other person causes, but the chronic wear and tear of living with someone who cannot acknowledge their own damage. If this video hurts, it is a sign that you need to hear it. O Código do Despertar exists exactly so you can stop repeating this cycle. The guide is in the first pinned comment. Do not put it off. Start today. Here is where the real test begins. And it is more uncomfortable than the previous one, because it requires you to look at yourself with the same coldness with which you are learning to look at others. How do you react when someone points out a contradiction of yours, not an unjust accusation, a real contradiction, an inconsistency between your words and your behavior, a promise that was not kept, a reaction of yours that hurt someone without you having noticed? Observe what happens internally in the first 10 seconds after being called out. The first wave is always defensive. This is human. What defines you is not the first wave, it is what comes after it. If, after the first wave, the question occupying your mind is, "How do I save my image?" you are still operating dominated by the persona. If the question is this true about me?" you have begun the integration. Jung called this process individuation, the slow and often painful work of bringing into the light what was buried in the psychic basement, looking at it without destroying yourself, and transforming that into conscious substance. A person in individuation does not become a saint. They do become someone you can build upon, someone who already knows where they tend to fail, and therefore will not destroy your life in the name of blindness about themselves. And the person dominated by the persona, on the other hand, grows old, defending a version of themselves that was never entirely true, spending increasing energy to maintain a coherence that demands constant lying. This changes everything when it comes to trusting. You stop asking, "Is this person good?" You start asking, "How much is this person able to see themselves?" Because goodness, without self-knowledge, is fragile. It works as long as the world is kind. When the world tightens its grip, non-integrated goodness collapses into resentment, projected guilt, and toxic self-pity. And the person who was sweet turns into someone who bleeds onto whoever is nearby, not because they turned evil, but because they were never forced to look at the rage that was always inside them, and now under pressure, that rage has escaped through the first hole available. You have lived this, probably on the receiving end of the blood, perhaps also on the side of the one who bled. It is not shameful, it is information. And information, when read with honesty, stops being trauma and becomes a map. There is a second movement in this test. even more delicate. It is the ability to endure one's own complexity. Many people can admit a specific mistake, but collapse at the idea that they are made of structural contradictions, that they love and also envy, that they are generous and also petty in specific areas, that they want freedom and also dependence, that they desire to be seen and also fear being seen. The persona wants absolute coherence. The real soul is contradictory, and accepting that contradiction without falling apart is a sign of advanced psychological solidity. Whoever reaches this point stops needing to lie about themselves in order to bear themselves, and whoever stops needing to lie about themselves stops needing others to lie as well. That is when the entire architecture of one's bonds changes. Everything you have seen up to this point points to a truth that most people avoid. What you observe in others is always, to some degree, a clue about yourself. This does not mean that every criticism you have of the world is a projection. There are things that are objectively wrong, unjust, cruel, but even within legitimate judgment, the intensity, the recurring theme, what you notice before others, all of this draws the map of your shadow. The people who irritate you repeatedly have something to teach you, not about them, but about you. The people you admire irrationally do as well. Intense discomfort is an arrow. Excessive admiration is another arrow. Both point inward. This is the mirror effect, and it is one of the most powerful tools for anyone who wants to live with less psychic noise. Instead of fighting with the world every time it bothers you, you ask a silent question. What does this discomfort reveal about what I have not integrated? Instead of idolizing every figure who enchants you, you ask, what quality of mine am I delegating to this person to care for on my behalf? These two questions, asked with honesty and without masochism, begin to return to you pieces of yourself that were wandering through the world in other people's bodies. You will realize that much of your anger came from qualities of your own that were poorly translated. Much of your passion came from parts of you that were poorly inhabited, and that most of your suffering with specific people was, in truth, the suffering of not living certain parts of yourself that those people embodied in an exaggerated way for better or for worse. This does not nullify the mistakes of others. It does not excuse those who have hurt you. It does not ask you to embrace an aggressor. It simply gives control back to you. Because as long as the problem is entirely outside, the solution is also outside, and you remain dependent on the world changing in order to feel at peace. When part of the work moves back inside, you regain agency. You stop being a recipient of events and go back to being an author of response. And there is a dignity in this that the persona never offers. The persona offers approval. Integration offers roots. They are different things. Whoever has approval without roots lives in fear. Whoever has roots without approval lives free. You have experienced both. You know which one weighs more at the end of the day. Perceiving human patterns with this depth brings a dangerous temptation. The temptation to use this insight to dominate, to predict the movements of others, anticipate weaknesses, manipulate bonds, and feel superior for seeing what others do not. Jung was clear on this point. Depth psychology, when poorly integrated, produces monsters more sophisticated than ignorance. Whoever reads the shadows of others without having looked at their own becomes a cold, cynical, dry strategist. They win arguments but lose their soul. They collect diagnoses of those around them and do not notice that they are alone. They become the relentless observer, but on the wrong side of observation. They spend their life with their finger pointed at human nature, waking up every day with the same ache in their chest, without understanding why. The true use of this wisdom is different. It is to develop compassion without naivety. It is to stop judging people for mistakes you now understand as structural, without, however, handing your life over to them out of charity. It is being able to say no to someone without hating them. It is being able to love someone without idealizing them. It is being able to distance yourself from someone without constructing caricatured narratives about their wickedness. It is being able to approach someone without handing over the keys to your soul at the first smile. It is knowing that every person is at their own point in their process, and that your role is neither to save them nor to punish them, but to adjust your closeness to their reality. And this, when practiced, dissolves much of the drama that currently consumes your energy. You stop expecting from others what they cannot give without having done the work you are doing now. And you stop punishing yourself for not being able to extract from them something they do not have to give. If you have made it this far, something in you is already ready for the next phase. And it is not motivation, it is exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of continuing to repeat the same cycles with different people, of receiving the same blows with different names, of waiting for a peace that does not come because the internal foundation that would sustain it is missing. The Código do Despertar exists for this foundation. It is 60 days in which you receive a daily lesson anchored in the psychology of Carl Jung, a practical key, surgical questions for your journal, and a micro-action for integration into the real world. You will not turn into another person. You will stop inhabiting only the facade of the one you already are. The guide is in the first pinned comment. This video may be the last one you watch on this subject without taking action. Or it may be the milestone from which you stop waiting for authorization to become who you have always been beneath the mask. The choice is now, not tomorrow, not when you are less busy. Now. And here is the point that no one wants to hear, but which Jung repeated without ceremony. Seeing others clearly begins with the effort to see yourself. There is no psychological shortcut. There is no reading of others that dispenses with the reading of oneself. All technique without this work becomes arrogance. All discernment without this work becomes paranoia. Whoever looks at themselves stops accusing the world by reflex. Whoever looks at themselves stops expecting from others what only their own inner work delivers. Whoever looks at themselves stops reacting and starts acting. And then everything changes. The type of person who approaches you changes. The type of person to whom you open the door changes. The type of conversation you tolerate changes. The quality of silence at home changes. What you accept calling love changes. What you accept calling family changes. What you accept calling yourself changes. Individuation does not promise constant happiness. It promises truth. And the truth, when it finally occupies the place that belonged to the mask, brings a specific type of peace that the persona could never deliver, no matter how much approval it gathered. It is the peace of those who no longer need to pretend, of those who no longer need to beg for an image, of those who no longer confuse being accepted with being real. It is the rugged peace of those who have traded the lightness of the lie for the density of presence. And whoever tastes this peace can no longer go back, not out of virtue, out of physiological inability to continue playing a role after having tasted one's own face. You can close this video and continue to trust the first smiling mask that appears on your path, to idealize the next brilliant figure who will fill your void for 3 weeks, to convince yourself that next time it will be different without anything inside you having changed. Or you can accept the price of freedom. You can accept that seeing hurts and that seeing sets you free. You can accept that the persona served as long as it was possible and that now it is time to inhabit what it had been hiding. The guide is in the first comment. There is no second version of this moment. The illusion is over. Choose.